The laughter started before the plates were even cleared. Ray Holloway heard it from the serving corridor, that particular kind of laughter that doesn't need a punchline because the joke is standing right in front of it. He set down the tray he was carrying and stood still for a moment, listening. Then he walked back into the banquet hall anyway, because walking away would have been worse. The Grand Forum of Varith Crossing was built to hold 40 species comfortably. Tonight it held 32, all seated at curved tables arranged in a wide half-circle around a central presentation floor. The Krellian delegation sat closest to the front, 6 of them, tall and angular, with pale exoskeletons and the kind of stillness that made them look like furniture until they moved. Their leader, Draven, had not laughed. He didn't need to. He had simply looked at the human food spread, turned to the Thrinic ambassador beside him, and said, loudly enough for the translation system to catch it, chemically unstable, offensively pungent, an insult to civilized digestion. That was enough. The room had done the rest. Ray stood near the edge of the serving area and watched. The human dishes, 3 hours of prep, 2 weeks of planning, sat mostly untouched on the presentation table. A slow roasted grain dish with fermented vegetables, a spiced protein stew with charred flatbread, a sweet course made from dried fruit and pressed oil. None of it looked like much under the cold, white light of the forum. Ray knew that. Station lighting was designed for Krellian visual processing, which registered in the ultraviolet range. Under UV, human food looked gray and flat. He had flagged this 3 weeks ago in a formal memo to the logistics team. The memo had been filed. Nothing had changed. Ambassador Sorrel was at the diplomatic table doing damage control, speaking in low, careful tones to 3 different species at once. She was good at that, holding multiple conversations without letting any of them feel ignored. Ray had watched her work before and respected it. Right now she had the look of someone defusing something that was already halfway detonated. Draven was still talking. The translation feed in Ray's earpiece picked it up cleanly. We were told the human contribution would represent their culture. If this is their culture, it explains the delay in their integration into galactic society. A species that sustains itself on rotting organic matter and thermal damage should not be surprised to find itself at the edge of the table. More laughter. Softer this time, but real. Ray looked at the flatbread. It had taken him 40 minutes to get the char right, just enough to build a crust without drying the interior. His grandmother had taught him the technique when he was 9 years old, standing in a kitchen on Earth that smelled like cumin and old wood. She had made him practice until his hands knew the motion without thinking. He picked up the tray he had set down and walked back to the kitchen corridor. He was not angry. Anger was loud, and it spent itself quickly. What Ray felt was quieter than that. A specific kind of focus that came when something mattered enough to do correctly. Back in the prep kitchen, he set the tray down, sat on a low stool, and opened his personal tablet. He pulled up the station's diplomatic event calendar and found the open slot for cultural demonstrations in the next scheduling cycle. 12 days out. He opened a formal request form and began filling it in. Name of delegation: Human, Earth Compact. Nature of request: second cultural demonstration, culinary focus. Estimated duration: 3 hours. Equipment required: full kitchen access, atmospheric adjustment to standard human range lighting. Open invitation to all delegations currently stationed at Varith Crossing. He submitted it before he stood up. Sorrel found him 20 minutes later, still in the prep kitchen, cleaning down the surfaces. She looked tired. She always looked tired after forum events, but tonight there was something extra in it. You saw that, she said. I heard it, Ray said. And then I saw it. I'm sorry. The lighting memo, I pushed on it twice. Logistics said the UV adjustment would cost 3 days of rescheduling across 4 delegations. I know. She leaned against the doorframe. We're going to let this pass quietly. Draven is difficult, but he's influential. We don't need a confrontation. I'm not confronting anyone, Ray said. He handed her his tablet with the submitted request still on the screen. Sorrel read it. Her expression didn't change, but he saw her eyes move through the details twice. They'll approve this to laugh at us again, she said. I know that too. She handed the tablet back. There was a pause, the kind where a person is deciding whether to argue or trust. Sorrel had been in diplomacy long enough to know the difference between a mistake and a calculated move. She studied Ray for a moment. What are you planning? She asked. A meal, Ray said. A real one this time, with proper lighting, proper time, and the right guests. And you think that changes something? Ray turned back to the counter and began stacking the clean dishes. Draven's species has been eating nutrient slurry for 400 years, he said. They've never had a meal that meant something. They don't know what that feels like. He set the last dish down. I'm going to show them. Sorrel was quiet for a moment. Then she pushed off the doorframe and walked out without saying anything else. Ray took that as a yes. The approval came back in 6 hours. Ray read the attached note from the station's event coordinator, a Thrinic named Yasa, which said, in polite but transparent language, that the request had been approved in the spirit of continued cultural exchange, and that several delegations had already confirmed attendance out of curiosity. Ray understood what that meant. They were coming to watch a second failure. That was fine. He didn't need them to expect anything. He just needed them in the room. He spent the rest of that evening in the prep kitchen, not cooking, thinking. He sat with a blank planner sheet and a cup of cold tea and worked through what he knew about each species that would be present. Their biology, their sensory ranges, what they processed and what they couldn't. He had done this kind of research before, back on Earth, working private events for delegations passing through the Geneva Compact offices. Every group was different. Every group had something. You just had to find it. The Thrinic, Yasa's people, experienced taste primarily through moisture contact on a series of small sensory pads along their inner jaw. They were sensitive to salt and mineral compounds. Sweet and bitter largely didn't register. The Orvani processed smell as their dominant sensory channel. What humans called taste, the Orvani called near smell. A dish that smelled strong to a human would be overwhelming to them, which meant low aromatics, high texture contrast. The Krellians were the problem. They consumed nutrient slurry through a sealed feeding process that bypassed most external sensory contact. Their digestion was internal and clinical. But Yasa had said something offhand the day before that Ray kept returning to, that Krellians had a secondary sensory organ called the vellus K, located in the upper facial structure, that responded to airborne aromatic compounds. Not for eating, for environmental processing. They used it to detect chemical signals in their natural atmosphere. Danger, territory, season. No one had ever cooked toward it because no one had ever thought to. Ray wrote that down and circled it. He was still at the table at midnight when the kitchen door opened. Yasa stood in the doorway, small, pale green, with wide horizontal eyes that gave them a permanent look of mild surprise. They were carrying a data pad and looked embarrassed to have been caught arriving. I wanted to see, Yasa said. The kitchen. I have never been inside a food preparation space before. Come in, Ray said. Yasa stepped in carefully, looking at everything. The surfaces, the equipment, the hanging dry goods, the small jars of spice lined up along the back shelf. They moved the way someone moves through a room they find both interesting and slightly dangerous. You are planning the demonstration, Yasa said. It wasn't a question. 12 days, Ray said. Yasa looked at the planner sheet on the table. You are studying us. Our biology. Your sensory profiles. I want to cook something each species can actually experience. Not just eat, experience. Yasa was quiet for a moment. Then, that is not how other species think about food. I know, Ray said. It's how we think about it. Why? Ray leaned back in his chair. He thought about how to answer that honestly without making it sound like a speech. For most of human history, we didn't have enough, he said. Food was hard to get. People worked all day and still went to bed hungry. So when there was food, real food, prepared with time and care, it meant something. It meant you were safe. You were home. Someone loved you enough to stand over a fire and make something good. He paused. You can't spend 10,000 years treating food like a sacred thing and not learn how to make it taste like one. Yasa looked at the spice jars on the shelf. May I? They asked, gesturing toward one. Ray nodded. Yasa picked up a small jar of smoked paprika and opened it slowly. They held it under their jaw pads, the Thrinic sensory contact point, and went very still. A few seconds passed. Then they closed the jar carefully and set it back in exactly the same position they had found it. That is extraordinary, Yasa said quietly. What is it? Smoked paprika. It's a dried and ground pepper. The smoking process changes the chemical structure, adds a layer of depth that the raw version doesn't have. It smells like warmth, Yasa said. That is not a logical description, but it is the only one I have. Ray smiled. That's the right description. He watched Yasa look around the kitchen again with different eyes this time. Not curiosity about equipment, but something closer to understanding. He decided to take a chance. I need one more piece of information, Ray said. About the VLSEK. Yasa looked at him carefully. You mentioned it briefly yesterday. I've been researching it, but the data available to non-Krellians is incomplete. I need to know what aromatic compounds activate it. Not to harm anyone. I want to cook toward it. I want Draven to feel something at that table that he doesn't have a word for yet. The silence stretched out. Then Yasa sat down across from Ray, set their data pad on the table, and began to talk. It took 2 hours. Ray filled 4 pages of notes. When Yasa finally stood to leave, they paused at the door and looked back. If this works, Yasa said, it will change something. That's the plan, Ray said. He picked up his pen and got back to work. By the 9th day, word had spread across the entire station. Not because anyone in the human delegation had promoted it. They hadn't. It spread the way things spread in enclosed spaces with multiple species and too much time between official meetings. Through corridor talk, through translated gossip, through the particular enthusiasm that comes when people sense a spectacle is coming. Commander Hesk, the Krellian military liaison, broad-shouldered even by Krellian standards, made a public statement through the station's inter-delegation feed. He said that the human request showed an admirable willingness to attempt dignity after public embarrassment, and that he would attend personally as a professional courtesy to the delegation. He then placed a quiet private wager with 3 other officials, 2 Orvani trade representatives and 1 veteran security chief, betting a week's worth of diplomatic credit that the humans would not produce anything worth finishing. Draven said nothing publicly. He simply confirmed his attendance, which was its own kind of statement. Ray heard about the wager from Yasa, who heard it from their own delegation's communications officer. Ray thanked Yasa for the information and went back to the kitchen. He had been sleeping in 4-hour blocks for the past 5 days. Not from stress, from time. There was simply too much to do, and 12 days was not a long runway. The menu had evolved through 6 full revisions. Each dish had to work on at least 2 species simultaneously, using different sensory channels, without the textures or temperatures interfering with each other. It was, in practical terms, the most complex coordination problem Ray had ever worked through. He had designed the 3rd course specifically around Yasa's VLSEK data, a slow braised preparation using a compound spice blend that, when heated above a specific temperature threshold, would release aromatic molecules in the exact range the VLSEK processed. He had tested the smell profile 7 times. Each time, he had written down his own reaction to the smell and compared it to what Yasa had described about the VLSEK response, the biological sensation Krellians registered as what their neuroscience called ancestral resonance. Ray didn't fully understand the neurological mechanism. He didn't need to. He understood what it meant: safety, belonging, the deep, wordless sense that you were somewhere that had been good for a long time. Humans called that feeling home. He was trying to cook home into a dish for a species that had never experienced it through food before. On the night before the demonstration, Yasa came to the kitchen again. This time they stayed until nearly 0300 station time, watching Ray work. He let them. Yasa asked good questions and sat quietly when there was nothing to ask. They tasted 3 things Ray offered them, small portions, carefully chosen, and gave honest, specific feedback without being asked. Ray adjusted the salt balance on the 2nd dish based entirely on what Yasa told him. At one point Yasa asked, "What does cooking feel like to you?" Ray was stirring something over a low heat. He didn't stop stirring when he answered. "Like writing a letter," he said. "Except instead of words, you use heat and time and ingredients. And the person reading it doesn't even know they're reading it. They just feel whatever you put in it." Yasa thought about that. "What are you putting in tomorrow's meal?" Ray was quiet for a moment. "Respect," he said, "for each person at that table, including the ones who came to laugh." Yasa left at 0300 without making a sound. Ray kept working. At 0340, Sorrel appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was in her off-duty clothes, plain gray, no diplomatic insignia, and she had the look of someone who hadn't been able to sleep. She stood in the doorway for a while without speaking, watching Ray move between stations with the steady, unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that their body knew the sequence without being told. You haven't slept, she said. I slept from 20 to midnight, Ray said. That's enough. Is it ready? Almost. She folded her arms. Tell me you know what you're doing. Ray lifted the lid on the third course prep and let the steam rise. The smell reached the doorway in seconds, deep and layered, with something underneath it that was difficult to name. Warm. Old. Like the air inside a place that had sheltered people for a very long time. Sorrel blinked. She stood there for a moment, not speaking. Something moved across her face, quiet and private, the kind of expression that doesn't belong in diplomatic corridors. She covered it quickly, the way people who spend a lot of time being professional learn to do. That's, she started. My grandfather's spice base, Ray said. With modifications. She was quiet for another moment. Don't change anything, she said. Then she left. Ray put the lid back on, turned down the heat, and moved to the next station. He had one more dish to finish, the last course, the one he hadn't told anyone about. Something simple. No tricks, no biology-targeted compounds. Just craft and memory and care pressed into a form someone could eat. He worked through until the station's lights shifted from night cycle blue to morning cycle white. Then he cleaned the kitchen, changed his coat, and stood in the empty prep space for a moment. Tomorrow the room would be full. Tomorrow people would come expecting to watch something fail. Ray picked up his knife and began the final prep. He had no intention of failing. The grand forum had been reconfigured. The tiered seating was still there, but the central presentation floor had been cleared and set with tables. Real tables, cloth-covered, with individual place settings for each species adjusted to their biological requirements. Ray had submitted the setup specifications 4 days ago, and the station's logistics team had followed them exactly, which surprised him. The lighting had been adjusted to full spectrum neutral, not ideal for Krellian UV processing, but fair to everyone, including the food. Ray had submitted that memo himself. This time, it had gone through. 41 species representatives were present by the time he walked in. He came in from the side corridor rather than the main entrance, carrying his own serving equipment. No announcement, no introduction. He simply walked to the presentation station at the center of the floor and began setting up. The murmur in the room dropped slightly when people noticed him. Then it returned to normal. A few of the Orvani trade delegates whispered to each other behind their upper breathing flaps. Hesk sat near the front of the Krellian section, arms crossed, posture rigid. Draven was 2 seats to Hesk's left, and he was doing what he had done at the last banquet. Absolutely nothing. No expression, no movement. Just present, in the way that a wall is present. Yasa was near the back of the Threnic section, sitting very straight. Ray did not look at any of them for long. He looked at his equipment, at the heat surfaces, at the sequencing order he had mapped out on a small card clipped to his station. Then he looked up at the room and began to speak. His voice was calm, not loud. The forum's acoustic system carried it without effort. I'm going to present 6 courses, he said. I'll talk briefly about each one before it's served. Not to explain myself, the food doesn't need that. Just to give context. Because food without context is just chemistry, and that's not what this is. No reaction from the room. A few species were recording. Most were simply watching. He served the first course. It was a cold dish, pressed grain cakes with a fermented vegetable paste, dressed with a sharp oil and a light mineral salt compound specifically calibrated for Threnic jaw pad sensitivity. Simple. Ray talked through it while he plated, where the grain came from, how fermentation worked, why humans had developed it as a preservation method before refrigeration existed. He explained that every culture on Earth that had survived long enough to develop writing had also independently developed fermentation. Different ingredients, different processes, same solution to the same problem. Several Threnic representatives tasted it carefully. Their jaw pads moved in small, deliberate motions. 2 of them looked at each other and said nothing, which Ray had come to recognize as a significant Threnic reaction. The Krellians did not eat. They were not expected to. Ray had designed the experience with that in mind. The second course was warm, a slow-cooked legume preparation with layered spicing, served in small individual portions with a structured grain base. Ray explained the Maillard reaction while he served it, the chemical process that happens when proteins and sugars are exposed to heat, creating hundreds of new flavor compounds that don't exist in the raw ingredients. He said that every time a human cooked something over heat, They were performing a chemical transformation that their ancestors had first discovered by accident hundreds of thousands of years ago and had spent every generation since learning to control. More species ate. The Orvani took small portions and processed them with their near-smell response. Ray watched their upper respiratory flaps open slightly as the steam reached them. They didn't speak, but their posture shifted forward by a degree or two, which he counted as progress. Hesk had not moved. Draven had not moved. Ray went to the heat surface and began the third course. The smell reached the room before the plates did. It came in a wave, not sharp, not chemical, not the flat smell of nutrient processing that Krellians lived with daily. This was layered, deep. It moved through the room the way weather moves. You felt it before you understood what you were feeling. The spice blend had been heating for the precise amount of time needed to push the volatile aromatic compounds into the air at the right concentration. Ray had calibrated this 7 times. He watched. He watched Hesk's facial plates shift, a small, involuntary movement, the Krellian equivalent of a flinch. He watched 2 of the other Krellian officials straighten in their seats without appearing to realize they had done it. He watched Draven, still, controlled, diplomatic, and saw the moment the Velasike registered. It wasn't dramatic. It was a single breath, a pause, a stillness that was different from the previous stillness, less like a wall and more like something listening. Ray continued plating. He brought the third course to the tables. He set Draven's portion in front of him without comment, without eye contact, and moved on to the next place setting. Behind him, he heard the room go very quiet. He finished serving and returned to his station. He did not turn around immediately. He took a breath, checked his sequencing card, and then turned back to the room. Draven was not eating. Krellians didn't eat in the human sense, but he was sitting differently. His upper body was angled, almost imperceptibly, toward the dish in front of him. His facial plates were still, and then he stood up. The room noticed. Everyone noticed. Draven looked directly at Ray across the length of the forum floor. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled, but something underneath it was not. "What," he said, "is in that dish?" The room held its breath. Ray looked back at him and answered plainly. Ray listed the ingredients. He listed them the way he always listed them, clearly, without drama, in the order they had gone into the preparation. Dried bark from a tree that grew in a specific mountain region on Earth. Seeds from a flowering plant that humans had cultivated for 11,000 years. A root, fermented for 6 weeks, then dried and ground. A secondary compound extracted from the same root family through a slow cold process that took 4 days and produced roughly a tablespoon of usable material per kilogram of raw ingredient. He did not say, "This will affect your Velasike." He did not say, "I built this for you specifically." He simply listed what was in the dish, in plain language, and let the room catch up. Draven listened without moving. When Ray finished, Draven sat back down. He did not speak again immediately. The forum was so quiet that the ambient hum of the station's ventilation became audible. Ray turned back to his station and began the 4th course. He kept talking as he worked, more history, more context. He talked about how the spice trade had shaped human civilization, how wars had been fought over access to specific plants, how routes across oceans and mountain ranges had been opened not for gold or territory, but for pepper, for cinnamon, for the ability to make food taste like something other than nothing. He said that humans had crossed the known world and gotten themselves killed in remarkable numbers for the specific purpose of making meals better. He heard a sound from the Orvani section, a low, rhythmic exhalation that the translation system flagged as the equivalent of restrained amusement. Not mockery, the other kind. The 4th course went out. More species ate. The veteran security chief, who had been sitting with the posture of someone attending a mandatory briefing, leaned forward over the 4th course and stayed there for a moment too long, which Ray counted as a victory. Hesk had still not moved, but his arms were no longer crossed. The 5th course was the one Ray had been most uncertain about, uncertain not in the preparation, which he trusted, but in the timing. It needed to land when the room was already open, when the accumulated weight of the previous 4 courses had done their work. He waited until he felt the quality of the room's attention shift, from polite observation to something less guarded, and then he began serving. It was a simple grain pudding, cooked slow, with a reduced fruit syrup and a specific combination of warm spices that humans associated almost universally with comfort, the kind of smell that showed up in homes on cold days, in hospital rooms, in kitchens where someone was trying to make a person feel better about something hard. Ray had thought about removing it from the menu 3 times during the planning process because it felt too personal. He had put it back in each time for the same reason. The smell reached the room in stages. He watched it land. The phrenic section was the most visible. Their sensory pads were external, so their responses were easier to read. Several of them went very still. Yasa, at the back, had their eyes closed. Ray looked away quickly. The Krellians were harder to read, but the VEL-SEK response had already been primed by the 3rd course. The 5th course didn't target it directly. The spice profile was different, warmer, lower-frequency aromatics rather than the sharp compound blend from earlier. But it hit the general sensory range, and in a room where 6 Krellian officials had already experienced something they didn't have a framework for, the accumulation showed. Hesk set his hands flat on the table. It was a small thing. Ray almost missed it. But flat hands, open, on a surface, in Krellian body language, that was a posture of rest, of being somewhere safe. Ray had read about it in a xenobiology paper 3 days before the demonstration. He hadn't expected to see it. He turned away and went back to his station. The room ate in silence. Real silence. Not the silence of people being polite, but the silence of people paying attention to what was in front of them. Ray had been in enough kitchens and enough dining rooms to know the difference. This was the second kind. This was the silence that meant something had worked. He began the 6th and final course. He didn't talk while he prepared it. There was nothing left to explain. The course was what it was, a pressed sweet cake, small, dense, made from a recipe his grandmother had never written down. He had called her over a delayed comm channel on the 4th day of prep, catching her at 0600 Earth time because of the time differential, and she had talked him through it from memory while he stood in the station kitchen with his tablet and wrote down what she said. He plated it exactly as she would have. Small, centered, nothing decorative. The food was the point. He served it without a word. The room received it without a word. For 3 full minutes, no one spoke. The forum held 41 species representatives, a dozen support staff, 6 Krellian officials, and 1 Threnic observer who was sitting at the back of the room with tears moving silently down the sides of their face. Yasa did not seem embarrassed by this. They simply let it happen. Ray stood at the front of the room with his hands at his sides and let the silence be what it was. Hesk reached slowly into his uniform jacket and removed a small chip, the wagering token from the bet he had placed 3 nights before. He set it on the table in front of him, face down, and did not pick it up again. Nobody laughed. Nobody said anything at all. And then Draven, without looking at anyone, spoke. Not to the room, not through the diplomatic channels, but across the forum floor, directly to Ray. "I would speak with you," he said. "Privately. At your earliest convenience." Ray nodded once. "I'll be in the kitchen," he said. "Come when you're ready." Draven arrived 40 minutes later. Ray was cleaning the kitchen when he heard the door. He had expected to be kept waiting. Krellians move through the world at their own pace, and Draven more than most. But 40 minutes was not long by any diplomatic standard, which told Ray something about the state the man was in. Draven stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around the room with the slow, assessing sweep of someone cataloging an unfamiliar environment. He was taller than the doorframe required him to be. He folded himself slightly to enter, then straightened and stood near the wall, away from the equipment, as if giving himself space to retreat if he needed it. Ray gestured to the stool near the prep table. Draven looked at it, determined it was structurally appropriate for Krellian proportions, and sat. "You knew," Draven said. "About the VEL-SEK. I learned," Ray said. He kept cleaning. He had found long ago that people talk more honestly when the other person had something else to do with their hands. "I didn't know going in. I did research. You targeted a biological response. I cooked toward one. There's a difference." Draven was quiet for a moment. "Explain the difference." Ray set down his cloth and turned to face him. "Targeting would mean I used it as a weapon, something to manipulate you with. Cooking toward it means I found out what your biology responds to, and I tried to make sure the experience reached you. The same way I adjusted the mineral salt content for the Threnic, or kept the Orvani coarse low aromatic." He paused. "You were the most difficult. Your species doesn't have a vocabulary for what food can do to you. So I had to find a side door. Draven sat with that for a long moment. His facial plates made a small, slow movement that Ray couldn't read. What I experienced during the third course, Draven said carefully, is classified in Krellian neuroscience as a deep ancestral response. It is associated with environmental safety signals, atmospheric compounds that in our early evolutionary history indicated a location was viable for habitation. It is not typically triggered in controlled environments. A pause. It has not been triggered in me since I was very young. I had not thought it was still functional. Ray nodded. He didn't say anything. I did not enjoy the sensation, Draven said. It was disorienting. I was not prepared for it. Another pause. I also could not determine, for several minutes afterward, whether I wished it to stop. Ray turned back to the counter and picked up his cloth again. That's what we call being moved by something, he said. It doesn't always feel comfortable. It's not supposed to. Draven was quiet for a longer time. Ray cleaned the rear counter surface, checked the heat units, started the shutdown sequence on the prep station. The kitchen sounds filled the space between them without pressure. Eventually Draven spoke again. The Krellian Empire has been in formal diplomatic stagnation with 4 species for 31 years, he said. The primary stated obstacle in each case is what the other parties call cultural disregard. We have dismissed their traditions, their rituals, the things they do that serve no measurable functional purpose. He folded his hands in his lap. We considered these things irrelevant to productive negotiation. Ray said nothing. I begin to think we may have been incorrect, Draven said. Ray turned around and looked at him directly. What are you asking me? Draven met his gaze without flinching. You understand something about how culture functions as communication. How the things a species does, the things that look like sentiment, like tradition, like decoration, carry meaning that our standard diplomatic models do not account for. He paused. I am asking whether you would be willing to consult, informally, on how to approach what we have previously dismissed. Ray leaned against the counter. He was quiet for a moment. I'm a chef, he said. Yes, Draven said. That is precisely why I am here. Ray looked at him for a long time. Then he exhaled slowly and pushed off the counter. I'll need to think about it, he said. And I'll need Sorrel to sign off. Of course. And it won't work if you treat it like a strategy session. What I do isn't strategy. It's attention. He held Draven's gaze. You have to actually care about the people across the table from you. Not their resources, not their political position. Them. The things that matter to them. That's where it starts. Draven stood. He was very still for a moment, and Ray got the sense that something was being weighed and decided internally that he would never have visibility into. I will consider what you have said, Draven said. He moved toward the door. At the threshold he paused, the same way Yasa had paused 2 nights before, and turned back. The last course, he said. The small cake. What was the origin of the recipe? My grandmother, Ray said. She never wrote it down. I called her to get it back. Draven looked at him for a moment. Then he left. Ray stood in the empty kitchen for a while. The door opened again 20 minutes later. It was Yasa, smaller, quieter, still moving carefully through the space as if it required respect. They were not crying anymore. They looked like someone who had set something down and felt lighter for it. Will you teach me? Yasa asked. Ray looked at them. How much time do you have? He said. My delegation departs in 9 days. Then we'll start with the basics. He turned to the back shelf and began taking down jars. First thing to understand. Cooking is just organized attention. You decide what matters to the person eating it. Then you build toward that. Yasa climbed onto the stool at the prep table and set their data pad down, ready to take notes. The kitchen door opened one more time. Sorrel stood in the frame. She looked at Ray, at Yasa on the stool, at the jars lined up on the counter. She looked at the room, the same room she had stood in 3 nights ago, smelling something she didn't have a name for. She didn't say anything. She just smiled, small, private, and pulled the door shut behind her. Ray put the first pot on the heat. The first rule, he said to Yasa, is that you have to care about who you're feeding. If you don't have that, the rest is just chemistry. He turned on the burner. Now, let's start from the beginning.